The poet. The poet distilled his own liquor and had become so accomplished in this art that he could produce a fermented drink from almost any kind of organic matter. He carried it in a flask strapped about his waist, and whenever fatigue overtook him, he would stop at some lonely point and raise the flask to his lips. Then the world would change color as a soap bubble penetrated by a ray of light, and a great vitality would surge and break as a limitless ocean through him. The usual superfluity of impressions would fall away so that his senses would combine in a single vast ray of perception, which blinded him to lesser phenomena and experiences. Candles might be eclipsed in a chamber of glass, exposed to a cloudless meridian of the sun. His existence was one of a benevolent anarchy, for no one of his time was more immune to the influence of states and organizations. In populated sections, he might subsist as a scavenger on the refuse of others, but in the open country, he lived as a ruminant beast on whatever green things were acceptable to his stomach. A tall and angular man, with eyes of turquoise and skin of clear amber. He had the cleanliness and beauty of sculpture. Such beauty is not allowed to pass unnoticed. He had never sought out any contact with people except the ideal one of audience and poet. But it sometimes happened that the sexual hunger of strangers would be visited on him. This would occur when bodily exhaustion had overtaken him after some great expansion of vision, and when he had crept for refuge into an areaway. While he was resting there, some anonymous passerby who prowled the alleys at night might happen to notice the poet and enter beside him with hotly exploring fingers and ravenous lips. In daylight, the poet would waken to find his clothing torn open, and sometimes not only a dampness of mouths on his flesh, but painful bruises, and sometimes also a coin or a ring, or some other grateful token thrust in a pocket or in the palm of his hand. But he would straighten his clothes and continue upon his way without any shame or resentment, and the briefly lingering dampness of such embraces would outlast his memory of them. Mercifully, it so happened that scratching about for existence had grown to be automatic. It occupied none of his thought and did not intrude on the inner life of the man. His poems were not written down, for his was a genius of speech. An earlier period of his life had been spent in a singular kind of evangelism. Then he had gone into places of public resort and delivered speeches of exhortation. Hardly a day had gone by without some violence being used upon him. He was often impressioned and still more often was beaten. But gradually rage was purified out of his nature. He saw the childishness of it. Then he fell into silence for a time. He entered the places and looked about him and left them, addressing no one. For several years, this retreat into silence continued. When it was broken, the character of his speech had changed entirely. The moral anger had given place to the telling of marvelous stories, which he told in the open. His audience, then, was found among adolescents, boys and girls, who were poised for that brief and hesitant spell between the coming of wisdom and its willful rejection, which is the condition on which the young are admitted to. Pockets of social states, based on nothing pure in their natures. The poet had learned that his audience could only be found in this particular age group. Now, wherever he went, he would gather about him the young and beautiful listeners to stories. He would pick them up at the entrances to schools and parks and playgrounds. His very appearance would magnetize the young people. Instinctively, they would know him as a man who dared to resist the will of the organizations which they would be forced to succumb to. Adults would judge him to be a worthless crank of some kind, but the young were drawn to him with a mysterious yearning, and hung on his syllables as bees cluster on the inexhaustible chalice of a flower. Whoever loves the young loves also the sea. It was therefore natural that the latter phase of the poet's life should be spent on the seacoast. For 10 months now, he had lived on a tropical coast whose tremendous scape of open water and sky provided his stories with an ideal mise-en-scène. He had occupied a little driftwood shack. He could not remember if he had built it himself or if he found it already erected. It was situated at a point where the beach curved gently and smoothly inland and rose in a fan-like sweep of golden dunes. In a large iron drum cast up from a wreck at sea, he had distilled his liquor of fiery potency, and he kept his reservoir buried in sand behind his driftwood lodging. Whenever he gave them a signal, his youthful audience would assemble about him, and each time more would come, and each time from villages which were further removed. For a long time now, the poet had felt his stories so far had been little more than preliminary exercises to some really great outpouring, which might be more of a plastic than verbal creation. He felt that this culmination was now close at hand. The imminence grew in him with the warnings of fever. His body burned and thinned, and his gold hair whitened. His heart had swollen. The arteries were distended. At times he would seem to be holding an incubus in his bosom, whose fierce little purplish knot of a head was butting against his ribs and whose limbs were kicking and squirming with convulsions. Now and again arterial blood would spurt from his mouth and nostrils. He noticed these warnings of death's unspeakable outrage encroaching upon him, but he felt he had power enough to hold it in check until the event that he lived for had come to pass. It came that summer, late in the crazed month of August. The night preceding his coming, the poet had wandered along the beach in a state of delirium in which he had seemed to be making a steep ascent without any effort of breathlessness of climbing. And at the height of his progress, he could see below him as a picture puzzle with all its pieces fitted precisely together the whole of his time on earth. He noted triumphantly that the scattered instances had closed in a design, and that the design could be closed into a vision. When morning came, it dropped him down the whole way, but he knew for what purpose. It was to call the children. A signal fire must be lit to summon the children. He started immediately to prepare it, but for the first time, the inflammable stuff was difficult to gather. The fragments of dried wood seemed to be miles separated. He probed for them in the dunes and among the scrubby bushes until his knuckles were bleeding and the incubus in his breast had all but broken through the crumbling cage of his ribs. When finally there was enough to light the signal, a wind sprang up, and he had to oppose the wind. He had to crouch over the flames till they blackened the skin of his chest, and he had to embrace the fiery sticks with his arms to hold them together. Then all at once the opposition was over. The ocean took back the wind. The air was motionless, and the ocean appeared to be struck like a statue in a blaze of calm. And now the pillar of smoke rose thin and straight as a tree without any branches. The poet withdrew from the point of fiendish trial, dragging himself on hands and knees to the merciful restoration held in the drum. A single taste of it lifted him to his feet. Once more and for the last time, the limitless ocean surged and broke in his veins. That ocean of scarlet the butterfly boat rocks on, which is being alive. The pillar of smoke soon caught the children's attention. With faces barely washed for the early morning, they rose like birds from the villages to surge up the hillsides and tumble crazily down them, past the fenced-in fields where their parents labored the soil, past doorways where old women crouched in dull astonishment at their windy passage, past everything stationary, incensed as they were by the demon of rushing forward, responding as only the ones of their age could respond to anything thin as smoke but promising vision. A long way off, the poet could hear the cries and knew they were coming. He rose from beside the drum and walked erect and powerful to the end of the beach where the children would appear, with clothing cast off along the course of their journey and nude bodies shining with wetness. The children swept over their last separating dune and enveloped the waiting figure of the poet. In front of his driftwood lodging, he brought them to rest. There he stood in their midst and began his story. The scaffolding of the heavens remained very high, and he proceeded to build a stair for the children. They let their playthings go. The puppets of painted wreckage which he had carved for the children fell from their clasp as they began to take part in the narrative's action. They chased each other among the scars of foam. Their leaps were prodigious, their shouts were everlasting, and always he called them back for another lesson, stretching his wasted arms like the crossbars of a ship on a drunken ocean. He compelled them to understand the rapture of vision and how it could let a man break out of his body. Before the slanting wall of the driftwood house, his eyes shot arrows of pale blue lightning at them. He leaned and gestured and imitated the ocean. A huge blue rocking horse seemed to be loose among them, whose plumes were smoky blue ones the sky could not hold and so let grandly go of. The story continued till dusk, and at that time the children's parents came for them. The men of the villages had become suspicious of the poet. They now surrounded his lodging and called him out. The poet came out and stood exhausted among them, peering almost blindly into their faces, now that the poetry had forsaken his body and left him old and wasted and shrunken gray. Without any explanation, they told him to leave. The poet nodded agreement to their command and frowned with sorrow, seeing the children far away on the beach and moving further among the shepherding mothers. When all the dispersing crowd had gone from sight, the poet returned to his house. He wrapped in a piece of sailcloth his small collection of things, mementos of distances walked along the ocean. He said goodbye to the ocean. He waved to it gravely with one of his hands that were like the arrowy skeleton of birds. He turned back inland after his 10-month stay on the shore of the ocean. When he had climbed with an effort that took his breath to the highest dune, and had turned and looked behind him, where his residence of driftwood appeared even smaller than it actually was, as it huddled in growing night and in emptiness now at the edge of the plunging surf, he felt that finally all of his gold was spent, and what was remained was only the clink of copper. Suddenly, he resisted the thought of exile. He was bound to this place by more than 10 months' custom. This was the place where he had finally told his greatest story. And if he would be remembered at all, it could only be here, by the children of this coastal region. Staggering with exhaustion, the poet retraced his steps. Still for a moment as he approached the ocean, his brain could hold it. His vision still contained it. Then it rocked and split, and the dark showed through it, tremendous and rushing toward him. He fell on the beach. His body remained at that spot for a long, long time. The sun and the sand and the water washed it continually and swept away all but the bones and the stiff white garments. The children, scattering further than usual from their homes without the signal to draw them, happened at dusk on the skeleton of the poet. They had grown older, but had not yet discarded their tender feelings. They circled about the skeleton of the poet, bewildered and sorrowful, aware of a loss they could not express to each other. One of them finally went to the great iron drum containing the poet's liquor. Having once seen the poet drink of it, he cupped his palm in the liquor and drank a portion. The others followed suit. It coursed as flame through their bodies and made them reel. They became very drunk, and suddenly, of a single accord, They lay in the sand beside the huge iron drum and back of the driftwood shack and thrust and plunged their bodies against each other. Not far offshore, 2 vessels engaged in battle. One of them was sunk, and as night fell, the bodies of drowned sailors washed onto the beach. The children, by that time exhausted, wandered along the beach and gazed at the bodies which were beginning already to wear the look of corruption. Alone among them, the skeleton of the poet appeared immune to decay. And for the last time of all, for now they were old enough to be conscripted into the service of states and organizations, the children remotely sensed the presence of something outside the province of matter. Then they turned homewards. The wind blew about them odors of smoke and death as they returned to their villages, never again to rise from them as swallows when distant smoke announced them. Here is vision.